If you can believe it, I've actually been so immersed in my work that I think I've done too much, which is saying wonderful things about the residency. This is a great opportunity. Cascais is a beautiful place that I think as a community, as a whole, is investing in cultural production and in art. And it's been a very wonderful opportunity to come and to be able to be away from my own world, which is a lot of noise and movement, to focus and to think as I work on a new book project. So it's been wonderful. So I'm working on a project that's looking at the relationship between apartheid, which is prescribed as a crime against humanity since 1973, and Zionism, which is an ideology that was condemned as a form of racism and racial discrimination in 1975, but that was rescinded by the PLO in 1991 as they entered the peace process. The reason this becomes important is because in 2020, a number of human rights organizations, including legacy human rights organizations and Israeli human rights organizations, concluded that Israel oversees an apartheid regime. Part of that, one, it's very controversial and necessary that they say that, but the way that they come to this conclusion is to basically say that Israel became bad, that it was good, but bad government, bad decision, it didn't create a Palestinian state, it becomes apartheid. And so I'm working with my co-author, Professor John Reynolds, where we're troubling that, we're unsettling that idea to show it didn't become bad, but Israel, as based on a Zionist ideology, was discriminatory upon its creation because it imagined itself as establishing a state exclusively for Jews with a demographic majority that doesn't have room for Palestinian sovereignty and actually predicates the existence of Israel on the removal, the dispossession, and the containment of Palestinians. It's a settler colonial project that necessitates the erasure of an indigenous population. So the reports only tell us about the outcome of the discrimination. And what we're doing in this book is showing that outcome is rooted to this ideology, which gave birth to the idea. Sure. There's a lot of overlap between these two books. I didn't expect to write this second book. This wasn't my second book project in my mind. My first book project, Justice for Some, looks at the relationship between law and politics and law and power more generally, and examines how that relationship helps tell a story about the Palestinian freedom struggle from 1917, when the Balfour Declaration was established by British Empire that basically, said that designated Palestine as a site of Jewish settlement, to 2017, which is basically 100 years later, when we see a number of developments, but specifically at that time, Israel's relationship to Palestinians going to permanent warfare against the Palestinians that it occupies. And so I tell that story to tell a story about law, power, how law has actually advanced Israeli interests more than Palestinian interests, how law is not synonymous with justice, but is often the opposite of that, and it does very counterintuitive things, but also to say, well, what about the future for Palestinian freedom? And so I imagined that my second book project would be about looking for other forms of freedom outside of the state altogether, which we all need. I mean, especially in a moment where the whole world, right, is having to deal with mass forced displacement and refugees and asylum seekers. It's not enough to think of the state, which is only a 200-year-old concept, as the answer. And now the rise of the far right that wants to make the state even more ethno-nationalist. So but the second, instead of doing that necessarily, I'm now working on this, which I hoped would be a quick intervention in response to the attention to apartheid. So if these organizations finally agree with Palestinians that this is a system of racial and colonial domination, then what? What do we do? And part of the problem is that the international community wants to pretend like it's not happening. or wants to say that it's okay that it's apartheid because Zionists think that this is necessary, and the opposite would be anti-Semitic. So we're not getting into the heart of it. So this is more of a political intervention to help, set the tone, to insist this is a serious finding, and here are the implications, and here are the prospects for the future. I see decolonization as a future for the whole world. Even asking the question, a resolution for the conflict, it's not a conflict. It's not a conflict, right? Slavery wasn't a conflict. Apartheid wasn't a conflict, right? Colonialism is not a conflict. There is a system of a grotesque amount of power and domination by the only nuclear power in the Middle East. The world's empire's self-proclaimed ally against a stateless population that has been marked for removal and elimination. They can live as bodies, but not as Palestinians. They cannot be a people. So this is not a conflict. This is a settler colonial situation of extreme power imbalance and injustice. And so I see this as a freedom struggle. And like with all resolutions to freedom struggles, freedom. And freedom for all peoples. Freedom for all peoples. There is a way to envision that the answer is that we have to live as all belonging to the land, rather than imagining that it just belongs to us. And that's what Palestinians have been saying. We don't mind Jews here. Jews stay, right? Jewish Zionists, I should say, because there's Jews all over the world who don't believe in this. Jewish Zionists stay, but you cannot stay as our masters. You cannot stay when you're demanding exclusive sovereignty. That's not okay. Your presence is okay, but not the way that you dominate us. That is not okay. So I'm first generation immigrant born in the United States as a girl in the world. So my first seeing the world, I saw it as a girl. I didn't see it as a Palestinian. I didn't see it as a Muslim. I didn't see it as an American or an immigrant. I saw it as a girl. And I saw it very, very unfair. Very unfair. And so it was that lens where I saw, how people normalized what girls are supposed to do, how they're supposed to talk, the responsibilities they have, the privileges, the opportunities, that just made me want to fight all the time. And then that lens, that very young, naive lens, I didn't even have the language to call it feminism, but it was an instinct, is also how I saw the rest of the world. And it's how I evaluated poverty, and how I come to evaluate racism, and how I've come to evaluate colonialism, environmental degradation, neoliberalism. So this very, young lens has opened my eyes to the whole world. And as now someone living in the United States, I insist we can't understand. The United States is an important place because it's the US's primary ally and provides it with unequivocal financial, military, and diplomatic support. If it wasn't for the United States, Israel couldn't do what it does, period. So it's really important to work on that in the United States, which is where I focus. But I insist that we can't resolve this issue in the United States unless people there understand that the US is also a settler colony. Its settlers, British settlers who proclaim American sovereignty, commit genocide and the removal of hundreds of Native American tribes, and has never admitted genocide, but says instead they died by war and disease. How are we to understand settler colonization in Palestine as Americans if we don't understand it on the lands that we live on, where we are the settlers? And the same thing when we think about Black freedom in the United States. Black communities are fighting a liberation struggle and against a deeply embedded racism that has been incorporated into education, into finance, into housing, into loans, how you get loans, where you live, how you travel, how you're policed. And so, again, to be able to understand racism and state violence against Palestinians, you have to understand it against Black communities and to be committed to fighting it in the United States, to be able to fight it anywhere else. So these are the ways that, I'm not a nationalist. I'm not a nationalist. I really believe in that we are fundamentally born to be good. But this concept of scarcity, right? That there's a limited amount of resources that only a few can have, is what makes us fight over it. And that fight is what we describe as politics, right? And so how do we overcome this concept of scarcity to understand that, in fact, there's enough for all of us, that our survival is mutually reinforcing, not exclusive, right? The whole idea of the Zionist idea of creating a Jewish homeland is actually a reflection of this scarcity, because Europe rejected Jewish people, rejected them as citizens, rejected them as humans, predicated that Jews can be accepted if they no longer are Jewish, but they become more like us. They have to assimilate, right? And so Zionists decided that in order to become fully European, they have to have a state of their own. And rather than resolving the issue of their exclusion, they decide to create exclusion to be accepted. So, I don't think that that's the answer. I think we've created another, they've created an answer that basically has said that in order for Zionism to persist, Palestinians have to disappear. And that shouldn't be an answer for anyone. And unfortunately, because of Islamophobia, right? Because we don't really talk about racism. We haven't really studied anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism becomes some one bad thing that one evil person named Hitler did. So we don't study it, right? We just, because of an ignorance and because of a racism and a colonialism, we accept that Palestinians are supposed to die, right? And so my work in revealing this and in doing it is obviously connected to the work of all liberation against racism, against homophobia, against xenophobia, right? Against settler colonialism, against capitalism, in order for us to because capitalism is all predicated on, some can be rich, but it means others must be poor. That is exactly how it functions. Somebody must be exploited. Somebody's labor has to be taken. Somebody's time has to be worth less. Somebody has to do the other work. And so all of this, I feel, is all predicated around the same idea. And so, yes, I work primarily for Palestinian freedom, but from that, I'm really working for another world possible. And I'm working alongside so many amazing people all over the world that are doing this work. I wish. I want a writing routine. I love when, I meet writers who say, yes, I wake up every morning, 5 a.m. and I sit and I write 300 words a day. I really wish. Sometimes this is my writing routine. I read. Nobody writes if they don't read. Writing is a reading practice. So I read. Notes. Then I go crazy in my head. Then I have a conflict in my own head that happens for a long time. And even if I'm sitting with you and having dinner, there's something happening here. It becomes an obsession. It's not healthy. And then finally, I start to take those pieces out, put them down on paper. And, what I discovered is that I actually don't know the answer when I start to write. But I start to write because in the process, I could see things happening and I start to think and put things together and move things around. And then I share it with people I trust who also read, who tell me how they're reading it, who argue with me, and then I argue back, and then it reflects on the paper. And so it's more of a thought process It's more of a thought process. And so that's what I've been doing here. I've been having fights in my head. Not this time, unfortunately.
But you've been here before.
I have. This is my third time here. The first time I came, I was invited by Uncommon Grounds in Lisbon to present my book. And so during that visit, I met a number of people. I was able to experience Fado, to experience a little bit of more of the urban life on this. And then I came again for a conference, and this is the third time. And on this trip, I've honestly not, I've stayed kind of to myself to take advantage of this opportunity. I don't know if that's right. You know, it's a bit of a contradiction, because you get an opportunity to be all by yourself, which is, you know, anybody knows is very, very rare, right? If you have a job, children, commitments, but you're in a place where you can learn so much. So it's been a bit of a balance. I'm going to take a break. This is my last week, so I'll take a bit of a break to see more. Never to write again. Easy. Because I can always speak. And the oral tradition is a strong tradition. So the saddest thing to do would be not to be able to read, because it limits. There's many ways of learning, but for me, this is a primary form of learning. And not just reading fiction. I love literature. I love, you know, watching a movie is amazing, but you're so passive as somebody who watches cinema, right? But when you read, you have to do work. You're working with the author and thinking and imagining. And so it's the same thing in any kind of reading practice. Yeah, that was easy for me, but also because I was first a speaker. I'm a speaker first. I write later. I teach myself to write because as a woman in the world, I was taken more seriously when people have to read my ideas and not just listen to it. Because when they listen, other things are happening. Oh, you're inspiring, or you're very passionate. It becomes, you know, commentary about me. When, you know, I want it to be commentary about ideas. And so, yeah, I would read.
Noura, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.